on October 7, we had an attack, and Hamas attack on Israel. And in your peace proposal for the Middle East, you talk about that this attack was largely unprovoked aggression. When it comes to that day, what's your understanding of that day?
Unprovoked aggression maybe wasn't entirely accurate. It doesn't really capture what I was trying to say. What I was trying to say is that it was really an atrocious, horrendous attack. It was a terrorist attack. I don't think any babies got their heads cut off or any of those propaganda stories. But regardless, there were nearly 1,200 Israeli civilians that were brutally slaughtered by Hamas. The problem is that doesn't, justify what Israel's been doing since. I believe that an Israeli military response was absolutely justified. I believe Israel has a right to defend itself. But when you go in and invade, the country from which the attacks originated, and you're occupying them with an indefinite duration, it's no longer a matter of self-defense. So when we hear Republicans talking about, this is Israel's right to defend itself, to brutally bomb and starve, as many Gazans as they want, in pursuit of their unachievable aim of destroying Hamas over a period of years. I mean, that's just it ceases to be defensive and it becomes more of an act of aggression. So I do view what Hamas did as a horrible act of aggression. Certainly, there was some provocation in terms of the way Israel has treated Palestinians historically, treating them as second-class citizens, essentially, with an apartheid system, as Dr. John Mearsheimer stated. I would not go so far to say that Israel is committing any genocide. Certainly, they've committed war crimes in bombing and starving 22,000 plus civilians, almost entirely women and children, to death. And that's a level of a daily death rate that's equivalent to over 9 times as many civilians killed by Russia and Ukraine. And we've denounced Putin as a war criminal for killing 9 times less per day. So, I do think we need to call Netanyahu to account for these crimes, and I think the U.S. should make any additional military assistance conditional upon Israel ending their accepting a immediate permanent ceasefire in Gaza, as well as ending the air, land, and sea blockade of Gaza that's killing all these innocent Gazan civilians.
Larry, when it comes to that day, how did you find that day?
Well, I first applaud David for his efforts to try to come up with something constructive. There are too many people out there just throwing rocks and not trying to come up with anything constructive. But I think part of the problem is that the West has accepted a definition of what happened on October 7th that just doesn't line up with the facts. The Israeli version is that this was an unprovoked attack, that it was reckless violence, just indiscriminate violence, directed in every direction, with raping, murdering children, baking babies in ovens, and this was all Hamas, and they're bad. I maintain that the evidence shows that this was a pre-planned military operation. And I emphasize military because they had 2 clear objectives. One, Hamas attacked Israeli bases, Israeli military bases. They attacked and defeated the Golani Brigade, for God's sake, and took tanks, took equipment. So, it was first and foremost a military attack. And secondly, it was to collect hostages, gather hostages up, take them back. The evidence that has emerged since is that the cars that were fleeing the rave event, which is where most of the casualties took place, those cars were destroyed by air-to-surface missiles fired by Israeli pilots. And they had no way of identifying who was in the automobiles. They ended up killing probably the majority of the Israelis who died at that site were killed by Israeli pilots, not by Hamas. Similarly, in the kibbutzim, there are at least 2 eyewitnesses to one event I know where the Israeli tank was outside a house. There were 3 Hamas fighters inside with 15 hostages. The Israeli tank destroyed the house, killed all the hostages, including a baby, and in order to kill the Hamas fighters. And that testimony comes from Israeli women who were there. So that's why I say this puts an entirely different perspective on it, that it was not just Hamas waking up one morning and said, boy, I feel like I'm going to go out and kill me some Israelis, kill me some Jews. No, this has a context that goes back really to the start of 1987 when Hamas formed, because Hamas formed in response to Israelis killing unarmed Palestinians. And that's been the theme all along. And when you total up the body count of Israelis killed by Hamas and the body count of Palestinians killed by Israelis prior to October 7th, it's the Palestinians have suffered far more casualties than the Israelis by a factor of 20. So it's not even, it's been disproportionate all along. And now what is, as David correctly noted, what's happened since October 7th by the Israelis? Absolutely stupid. You've just got completely undisciplined military.
David, when we talk about Hamas, whenever we talk, it seems that Hamas was created on October 7th, because we have to get to the roots of these organizations, these people who we are calling them Hamas. In your opinion, what was the reason behind this group? What was the necessity of having this group in Gaza?
Well, I mean, as I'm sure Larry is aware, Hamas was formed in large part due to the efforts of Israeli intelligence to organize a resistance group against Fatah. So, in essence, Israel can be blamed for the Hamas attacks because they helped create Hamas. Hamas might not even exist without Israeli intelligence assistance. But yeah, Hamas has always been viewed as a more militant group between itself and Fatah. It took over. There was kind of a military coup situation. I think there were some mitigating circumstances which I'm not fully aware of, that I'm sure Larry could bring up and educate me more on. But essentially, Hamas seized control after they won parliamentary elections. I think in 2006 they seized control of Gaza in 2007, and they've kind of ruled along with Fatah in the West Bank, with their own kind of dictatorship there without elections for about the same number of years. And they only had about support of, I think, according to poll I saw before the October 7th attack, it was like 36%. So the problem I see in the U.S. and Israel, and that I was really alarmed about after these attacks, was because I was extremely fearful with the statements coming out of Israeli leaders that maybe we should nuke them, we should exterminate them, we should, Lindsey Graham and folks like that were like, let's do what we did to Dresden, in Gaza, or maybe Hiroshima. Is that they equate, and this is true with conservatives that I know that are otherwise fair-minded, good Christian conservatives. They believe that every Gaza civilian, I guess including babies, support Hamas, and that's simply not true. And even if it were true, unless they've committed acts of terrorism, they're not legitimate military targets for Israel. And so the idea of equating enemy civilians and adversarial civilians, I've been fighting against this since, as a matter of World War II history. I think what we did, the Japanese and Germans were brutal and mass murdering, starving and bombing, terror bombing, 2.6 million acts of civilians to death was a great war crime, and no one was held accountable for that. And obviously what Israel is doing is not on that par with the level that U.S. leaders did at the time. But we still need to take a stand. I mean, if we purport to hold, Christian principles or even just humanitarian principles as a country, we have to take a principled stand against what Israel's doing. And one evil doesn't, one wrong doesn't make, I forget the saying, but essentially, two wrongs don't make one right. So just because Israel was right to respond militarily and bomb the crap out of Hamas after the October 7th attacks, maybe even engage in a partial invasion along the lines of the 2009 Gaza war, which was an 18-day campaign that, degraded Hamas without killing a lot of innocent Palestinians, as Israel's been doing here today. It doesn't justify them staying there, more than a few weeks and occupying them in perpetuity with no humanitarian plan whatsoever. Not to mention the fact that it really is. I mean, this is a collective punishment campaign by Israel, much like we did against the Germans and Japanese during World War II. And there's no opportunity for the Gazans to overthrow their Hamas dictatorship, essentially, and then throw down their arms and unconditionally surrender. So it's a grossly immoral policy, and it needs to end.
Larry, how do you find the roots of Hamas, and is Hamas a dictatorship in Gaza?
No, I think that the Israelis have created, as David mentioned, this problem for themselves. So when you go back to 1987 and Sheikh Yassin held that meeting shortly after that Israeli truck ran over these 4 Palestinian civilians, that was really the start of Hamas. Well, you got to step back and say, okay, what else was going on at that time? So as we get into 1989, 1990, 1991, 92, the Oslo Peace Accords, that whole peace process had started. And from basically the time Bill Clinton got in office, you had a successive recognition of Yasser Arafat. He was with the PLO. Fatah was being acknowledged and accepted as the primary interlocutor. Well, Israel outwardly was saying, oh, okay, yeah, we agree. And then quietly through their covert action, they were funneling money into Hamas. So Hamas organized on its own initially out of the outrage of what the Israelis did. But man, then the Israelis started pumping money to them. And, David's probably seen the commercials, where Dobler, that this one offensive tackle would say, hey, did you hear what this guy said about your sister? And then he'd turn to the other guy and he'd try to get them both fighting. Well, that's what the Israelis were doing. Conrad Dobler was the guy's name. The Israeli was acting a little bit like Conrad Dobler. They were doing what they could to boost Hamas so that Hamas would carry out attacks and weaken Fatah and provide an impetus for the Israelis. Says, see, we keep offering these Palestinians a peace process and they keep rejecting it. Well, they're putting their thumb on the scale, for God's sake. And then, if it was like in 1990, 91, you had the Temple Mount massacre, where once again, Israeli police and military opened fire on unarmed civilians. Now, the one thing I can tell you, having listened to David on some other programs and read his writings, the Israeli army would be light years ahead if they had officers like David. Because David was raised with a military tradition and a sense of honor and was taught, you don't shoot unarmed people. And he understands that troops are going to do stupid shit, okay? You get PFCs and corporals that will make bad decisions. That's why you have officers there to make sure that they don't make bad decisions, that they understand what the standards are. And what we've seen from the Israeli army, particularly since October 7th, is it's an abomination. It's a disgrace to anything that's military. The simple example of those 3 Israeli hostages who escaped from Hamas and tried to walk out towards Israeli lines, no shirts on, waving a white shirt, and the soldiers still shot them. So that shows you that the rules of engagement the Israelis are following are, we're going to kill unarmed people. This isn't about engaging an enemy and defeating an enemy. This is about destroying a people. So I think it's out of that why I say the blowback has come. Hamas prior to October 7th wasn't that popular. It's wildly popular now, and not just in Israel. It's popular across the region, in Egypt, in Turkey, in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia. And we ought to get a button made up with Netanyahu going, I did this. That's exactly what he's done. He's made Hamas a superhero.
David, when it comes to the response from the Netanyahu administration and their strategy on attacking Gaza, what was the problem with their strategy in the first place?
Well, again, first of all, I want to agree with pretty much everything that Larry just said. Israel, they have, just like the U.S. has in Ukraine, they have essentially unachievable aims. Their aim is to, destroy and annihilate Hamas, and that can't be done militarily, except through a extremely brutal campaign over a period of years. And if we think the humanitarian cost is high now, I mean, just imagine what it would be 3 to 5 years from now. We just, multiply it and have a couple 100,000 dead civilians in our hands, I think. But I think, there's any war plan, unless it's truly possible to achieve unconditional surrender and, destroy an enemy army, as we did in Germany or Japan. There has to be, some kind of viable peace options, and that's what I've attempted to do here with this peace plan that I laid out a couple months ago. In the realization, and I think it's, I view it as a little bit pro-Israel, because I believe that Israel is the dominant winning power, and it's not that they're winning the war in Gaza. I think there's a good argument to be said that they're losing the war, but it's that their military dominance is so overwhelming. It's much more dominant even than Russia and Ukraine, that we have to essentially get the Israeli, come up with a peace plan that's minimally acceptable to Israel. And I'd love to see it my peace plan modified in a more pro-Palestinian direction. I'm very uncertain as to whether Israel would agree to it. So for the same reasons, that's why I came up with the peace plan for Ukraine that I thought was minimally acceptable to Russia, because they're the dominant power in that fight. There has to be, and there has been, some kind of rudimentary peace plans issued by Israel, but it's been on a piecemeal basis. There's a lot of indications that they're not really serious about it. Essentially, what they want is they want a free hand to do whatever they want to Gaza. And essentially, I think Netanyahu's ultimate goal is some kind of either actual or de facto annexation. With this collective punishment campaign, I think his hope is that Gazan civilians will be, the living conditions will be so terrible that they'll feel the need to leave Gaza. And unfortunately, Gaza is a prison. It's a concentration camp, essentially, with the Israelis surrounding it. They're trying to eliminate, take control of Gaza's, southern border and port of entry to Egypt. So there's really no place to flee. So by their own actions, they're defeating their own objectives. They aren't going to be able to ethnically cleanse the Gazans if they don't allow them a way to get out. And if Israel were simply shipping Gazan civilians out and giving them like a 10,000 or 20,000 check, I mean, that would be better than I think what they're doing right now. But it's not, it's not at all humanitarian. It's not justifiable. And I think Biden needs to get a lot tougher with them. He's made a lot of statements. He's really been kind of bipolar on Israel. On one hand, he's saying, well, our commitment to Israel is ironclad. On the other hand, he's calling for a ceasefire, which is exactly what we need to do. But there's no teeth in it. He's not conditioning U.S. military aid at all. He's giving them a blank check to do whatever they want in Gaza. And it's a bad policy. It's against U.S. national security interests. And I think it'll be ultimately self-defeating for Israel as well. We saw the Iranian, missile strikes on Israel. That was in response to a provocation that Israel did in attacking an Iranian diplomatic consulate in Syria. So they had to know that kind of attack would be coming in response to that provocation.
Larry, your take.
Well, the United States could actually impose a peace here, but it's politically untenable in the United States. All Biden would need to do is tell Netanyahu, hey, you're cut off now. No more money, no more weapons. You're done. This is going to stop now. They're not providing any more assistance. Well, that would ignite a nuclear eruption on the part of Republicans, not to mention among many Democrats. So that's why I'm saying it's politically untenable to do that in the United States. But if he did that, to force Israel to step back, this is that kind of intervention you do where if you've got a friend or a relative who's a degenerate drug addict, you got to intervene to keep them from killing themselves. Because I firmly believe that if Israel continues down this path, it will destroy itself. That whatever military might it has, if it dares go into southern Lebanon to fight Hezbollah, it's going to get beat, as happened in 2006. Only this time, Hezbollah's far more prepared. They've dug in ways that they didn't dig in 2006, just as we saw that the Hamas dug in under Gaza. So, but if the United States and with Russia and China step in to separate the sides and say, okay, we're going to stop this killing, and you're going to get out of, force the Israelis out of Palestinian territory, including the West Bank, force them out. Get them out and get separated. But see, the problem with this is underlying all of this is this eschatological belief. You've got the Jews, this Jewish sect that believes this is preparation for the return of the Messiah. You've got the Muslims, the devout ones within the Muslim crowd. They also believe, hey, Jesus is coming back, but also the false Messiah. So they've got their own version of how the last day shapes up, and then get into Christianity, you got 3 or 4 different versions ranging from the Battle of Armageddon. And so these religious streams are actually playing a factor in all of this. That, what David proposes is rational, logical, trying to be reasonable. But man, when you throw religion in the mix, all that crap goes out the window. It gets into the gut and into the heart. So I think it's, unfortunately, I think where we're headed is that Netanyahu's going to ignore Biden's warnings. Don't hit Rafah. They're going to hit Rafah. They're going to try to go into southern Lebanon, and they're going to get smoked. 3 months ago, you had Erdogan in Turkey mouthing off, "Oh, Israel's like Hitler." Meanwhile, the trade was going on, the oil's flowing. So he's talking one thing and doing another. Now he's not. Now he's done the 180, or I guess Annalena Baerbock, what she calls the 360. But he's done a complete about turn and is now cutting off trade with Israel. Israel's economy can't sustain this kind of loss of over, to go into it a year or two like that. Can't do it. Plus the Red Sea port's still shut down. We can't even open that up against the Houthis. So, I wish, people would at least sit down and say, okay, Mr. Pyne's proposals are worth considering, and let's try to, calm the waters. But, I think we're now in an emotional territory where people just aren't thinking, they're acting.
Before October 7th, we know that Israel was on a good path of normalizing the relation with the Saudi Arabia and Turkey. And we know in that accords, there were no mention of two-state solution. And do you find this as one of the reasons of Hamas attack in Israel?
Yes, absolutely. And for good or for bad, I think Iran was 100%, the mastermind of these Hamas attacks. I mean, this was a coordinated attack against Israel, whether or not, someone considers it provoked or not. It was Iran that was kind of green lighted the whole operation. And it was in the works for about a year in advance. And Israel had fair warning that it was coming. And there's some evidence that Netanyahu, tried to, take action to prevent Israel from being ready to respond, even perhaps, standing down Israeli military forces with a withdrawal of a battalion from the border region with Gaza. So it's the real threat I'm worried about is, I was really concerned when Iran, popped off 300 ballistic and cruise and drone missiles and drones in attacking Israel, because That's really the nightmare scenario, is that you know, kind of a tit for tat, escalating with, you know, 300 missiles coming from Iran against Israel, and then back and forth. I believe Iran's a nuclear power. I believe it has been for some time. I think there are reasons why they're trying to, you know, hide the existence of their nuclear arsenal. I think Israel has reason to know it's a nuclear power. But if it doesn't, it's a far more dangerous situation, because, you know, if Israel tries to take out, you know, I think there's 38 plus hardened underground Iranian nuclear sites. They also have you know, nuclear, or they have missiles in silos that are nuclear capable, if indeed they do have nuclear warheads, that are long range, IRBMs, MRBMs. These are road mobile missiles in underground silos that are really impervious, I think, to almost, you know, any conventional military attack. Even most U.S., even the Moab with, you know, it's like 11 tons thermobaric warhead. I think it would be insufficient to potentially to penetrate these. But you know, there is a real risk of not only an interstate regional war breaking out, that's a full scale war, but that ropes in potentially the U.S., Russia, and China as well, but a potential nuclear conflict in addition.
Larry, do you think that was one of the reasons of this Hamas attack on Israel? And you can elaborate on what David said about Iran as being the mastermind of this attack.
Yeah, it may very well have been that the purpose was to derail the normalization of relations with Saudi Arabia, with Turkey, with others. And frankly, mission accomplished. It has effectively done that. What the lesson that's not being learned yet is, particularly in the United States, that maybe they understand it over in the halls of the Pentagon. I hope so. We can't take on Iran militarily. And they say, well, oh, wait, what are you talking about? Okay, let's start and let's look at the Houthis. 6 months in, we can't stop the Houthis. The Houthis have shut down the Red Sea. And with even a carrier task force group and repeated bombings of these mobile missile sites, we can't stop that. So why do we believe that we could go over to the coast of Iran and Iran could not shut down the Straits of Hormuz, number one? And not taking into account the fact that Iran's been conducting joint military, naval, and ground exercises with China and Russia for the last 4 years. And I'm sure, as David knows, if they started an exercise in 2019, that meant the planning process for that started in mid-2017, because, when you're planning these exercises, you're out 24 to 18 months. So that was already in the works. So they've now got a stronger military relationship with Russia and China. And the United States, when we went into Desert Storm in 2003, or Operation Iraqi Free, whichever one it was, I've lost my acronym, code names on those. We had about 750,000 strong in the Army at that time. We're down to like 450 now. And going into Iran it's 4 times larger than Iraq, for God's sake. So the tactical, logistical requirements to gear up to conduct a military operation, because you're not going to defeat Iran from the air. That's been the ridiculous nonsense spilling out of going back to Army Air Corps in World War II. They thought they could win World War II by the air power. And then the same Korea, Vietnam, we go on down the road. It was always, you got to put guys like David with troops on the ground that can go in and capture territory. I was involved with some exercises for Special Operations Forces, which dealt specifically with attacking what we will call hardened, deeply buried targets. The outcome of those exercises is not pretty. So what I'm saying is, the United States has been like this 3-year-old kid with a hammer. Everything looks like a nail, but you're going to hit it. We need to take the hammer away and start recognizing we've got to find some diplomatic solution, because we can't solve this militarily with Iran without jeopardizing ourselves. So we've got to come up with another approach. This war all the time is bankrupting our country, and it has increasingly put the burden on a particular class of citizens in America who are being attacked because they're too white, too Christian, too conservative. And guess what? Those folks aren't signing up to join either Army, Navy, Marine Corps, or Air Force anymore. They're having recruitment problems. And so with recruitment problems, we now want to get into a war with Russia and Ukraine, a war in Israel, and then a war with Iran, and then China. Somebody's got to take the keys away from us, okay? Because we're out of control.
David, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think Larry's absolutely right, and I apologize for not neglecting to answer your question, which Larry answered exactly the way I would have, which is it was absolutely timed to prevent, forestall the signing of the Israeli peace agreement with the Saudis, which I think I don't know if it would have been a game changer, but it certainly would have defeated Iran's plans to some extent to be kind of the regional hegemon of the Persian Gulf that I warned they would be back in 2005. I think I'm sure Larry was among those who opposed the war in Iraq, particularly because it would destroy the balance of power. Where Saddam was an effective counter that balanced out Iranian aggression and expansion, whether territorial or otherwise. That's the thing is as Larry mentioned, our we don't even have a strategy. It's one thing to have a bad national security strategy. We don't have a grand strategy.
Yeah.
Our grand strategy is exactly what Larry said. It's trying to fight every war, every civil war, get involved, regime change operations all across the world at the same time. And we're spread so thin that China is extremely confident that if they decide to blockade and invade Taiwan, either the U.S. won't react at all, or that the U.S. or they will succeed in defeating us in quick order if we attempt a military response, which I think would take probably 3 months to gather enough military resources to even try to liberate an occupied Taiwan. So we just need to realize that the U.S. it's not the sole surviving superpower. It's not even the strongest superpower. I would argue China and perhaps even Russia are stronger. We live in a world that's dominated by the Sino-Russian alliance, which includes Iran as a formal member as of 2022 or 2023, and North Korea kind of as an unofficial member. And the U.S. needs to, have a retrenchment strategy. I mean, in my ideal world, we would take all of our alliances and transform it into essentially a Taiwanese strategic ambiguity situation where we would say, yes, in some circumstances, the U.S. may decide to, use conventional or nuclear weapons in the event our allies are attacked. But, it'd be kind of, again, strategic ambiguity. There would be no ironclad commitments to Eastern Europe, to Western Europe, or to, our Pacific Treaty allies. And I think that would be sufficient to maintain the peace, but not in, obviously Taiwan that's a nuclear red line for China, whether we want to recognize it as or not. If we defend China militarily, we're going to lose that war, and we may lose the country as well, because China has, in my estimation, a lot more nuclear weapons than we do. They're allied with Russia. They have super EMP satellites, or orbital nuclear weapons in orbit. We have to learn to peacefully coexist with our enemies, nuclear adversaries. 4 nuclear adversaries allied together. We never faced this level of threat, even during the Soviet Union. I mean, certainly they had far more nuclear weapons, and arguably they were more of a threat in that area. But China has overtaken the U.S. in terms of, economically, in terms of purchase power parity. They have at least twice the manufacturing industrial base that we do. They can manufacture warships 230 times faster, 232 times faster. And, we can't be the bully on the block. We can't be the biggest bully on the block, as Colin Powell famously mentioned. We needed to be to kind of teach the world a lesson, not because Saddam Hussein's Iraq was a horrible country or posed any threat to the U.S., but because after 9/11, we needed to show that the U.S. was still boss. And this U.S.-led international order, it's not going to survive. We need to either modify it and retrench, or it's going to be modified against us, whether we like it or not, through war, world war.
Getting back to the conflict in Gaza, the new polls in Israel show that 78% of Israelis are supporting Netanyahu administration's policy in Gaza, and 68% of the people are against the Netanyahu administration. And you see how the public opinion in Israel is working in this conflict in Gaza. Do you think how much of this concept of this policy in Gaza is the production of the Netanyahu administration during all these years that they have been in power?
Is that for me?
Yeah, Larry.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you're familiar with Israeli citizen by the name of Ilan Pape. So Ilan his parents were German Jews that settled in Israel before World War II. So he was born in Israel. He's an Israeli. And yet he's a historian who has been forced into exile into London because of his writings. And one of the things that he's zeroed in on is this change, sort of the Israel that existed in the 1960s, 1970s, which was, let's call it largely more of a secular society, not so religiously driven with these visions that we're going to reestablish what the Torah says as far as what is Israel. That he has documented the change over the years, particularly the curriculum in the schools, showing how the curriculum that was presented in the schools actually created a mentality that's what you're seeing in these polls, that even though they hate Netanyahu, 78% of them still back the policy. That's the point a lot of Americans don't understand. Get rid of Netanyahu, it's not going to change Israel's policy. They're going to continue doing what they're doing to try to eliminate the Palestinian people, to expel them from this land that they view as all of Israel. And, Pape's not too optimistic in terms of how that turns out because of that kind of religious fanaticism. When you have religious fanaticism within Judaism, religious fanaticism within Islam, and religious fanaticism within Christianity, nothing good comes out of that mixture. That's combustible.
David.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very difficult situation. That's why it took me a while to really, kind of get my mind around what a peace plan, a workable peace plan that would be accepted by Israel would look like, because they have all the power essentially. They're 57 times larger than Gaza. I mean, we think about Israel, it's the size of El Salvador. Gaza is this tiny strip, it's like 27 miles long, I think 9 miles wide, if that. And it's, Israel could, if it wanted to, occupy it in its entirety, probably in short order. But it can't really, it can't really win the war. It can't really eradicate Hamas. Hamas has got underground tunnels. It's an unwinnable war for Israel. And so, if there were a rational Israeli leader, and it's possible that maybe a Labor Party prime minister might be willing to, kind of view the war in the same way I think some of the left-wing Israeli newspapers have, in publicly stating that Israel is losing the war. It's a debacle, a strategic debacle. Something needs to be done, and the only way to do it is through a ceasefire, some kind of workable peace plan that's minimally acceptable, or at least, something that Hamas might be willing to sign up for, so they get some chunk of, control of Gaza, with at least a goal of withdrawing all Israeli troops, and having some kind of self-rule, which is something that even the Israeli plan, the Gallant plan, said they would be willing to accept, you're not going to have this war end. And this Gaza war is really it's responsible for the proxy war with Iran. If you end there's no peace with Iran until you do really two things. You need to withdraw. We need to withdraw all U.S. troops out of Iraq and Syria. I would argue probably Jordan as well, at least Tower 22. And then we need to have an armistice and a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. And if you do that, then this war goes back to the way it was before, which was all quiet on the Middle Eastern front, essentially. Not to that extent, but it's never going to be total peace. But at least it won't be on the verge of a regional conflict.
Well, do
And
you
let
want to
me
add
ju-
something?
well, let me jump in and just say that there's one area where the interests of the United States and Iran and Russia all come together, coalesce. That's in fighting ISIS. So most people don't understand the history of ISIS. ISIS came out of Zarqawi back in late 2003 in Iraq. And he was this extreme Salafist, a Sunni Salafist, this, one caught up with all the ultra extreme interpretations of Islam. And what was driving him immediately? Killing other Iraqi Shias, because he viewed the Shias as, apostates. They were violating God's commandments, and he was there to impose the will of Allah on them. I mean, you got to be pretty extreme when Osama bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri are writing you letters telling you you're over the top, you're out of line, which is exactly what happened. The Al-Qaeda leaders told Zarqawi, hey, stop this, focus on the Americans, leave the other Muslims alone. But Zarqawi wouldn't do that. Now, he died in May 2006. I think end of June. I was over in Iraq with that, in the lead up to that. And so when I came back and they got him, I took credit for it. But it was because I was at Balad where they were doing the hunt for him. But once he's dead, still it lived on because he had created this movement, this ultra devout movement. Well, who did they attack? They attack Iran. They're carrying out terrorist attacks in Iran. In fact, just today, there was a terrorist attack in Afghanistan in a mosque. ISIS-K came in and shot up all these Shia worshipers. So they moved into Syria, and it was an odd thing because outwardly U.S. policy, we're in Syria to destroy ISIS, but meanwhile the covert action that was going through my old outfit and within concert with the Brits, arms flowing up into Turkey, Turkey parceling them out, and Turkey passing them off to some of these same Salafist Islamists aligned with Zarqawi and ISIS. And in fact, there were occasions where there were Iranian troops attacking an ISIS position, and we attacked the Iranians. Think about that. So there's, you've got all that, we've got all this baggage out there, but when everything, you clear it all away, the Iranians have the same interests we do, as do the Russians. Let's stop these Islamic extremists. Let's get them contained and unfunded and destroyed if necessary. Everybody would agree on that. And, you say, well, how could we have agreement? I guarantee you get the agreement on that. Of course, that'd mean the United States would have to stop sponsoring terrorists in Iran as well, because we're funding the MEC. We're now allowing the Mujahideen al-Khalq, who we had on the terrorism list, good God, from when I started at state in 1989, it was on the list. And then the Bush administration took it off in like 2006. And so if you're Iran, you're looking and saying, yeah, we hear the United States talk a good game about fighting terrorism, but here they are funding them. So I'm saying that just that one area alone, we concentrate and say, hey, let's agree to get rid of ISIS. I think the world will be better off with that.
David, when you look at this, it seems that the the Netanyahu administration is trying to attack Rafah. At the end of the day, they are so insisting on this policy. And do you think what would be the end game for the Netanyahu administration in Rafah? We know that so far they've removed something like 11% of Hamas, and they're declaring that that wasn't successful, but they're still insisting on attacking on Rafah. Do you think he's trying to be connected with those 78% of Israelis who are supporting this type of policies because of his political future, the future of his political party?
I think, yeah, I think that unfortunately the Iranian missile attacks and the tepid, on Israel and the tepid Israeli military response on Iran, I think that gave Netanyahu the confidence that the page was turned, and he now had a green light to to respond forcefully in Gaza. And I think that the Biden administration may not do much to oppose that, but it's absolutely true that Netanyahu is very unpopular, as you and Larry both said. That if the election were held today, his party would lose decisively, and he would be out of office. And unfortunately, his alliance with the far right Israeli parties have really constrained him, because it's hard to believe that, but Netanyahu is not really he's not really the far right of the Israeli political
Right.
spectrum. He's actually, I wouldn't, he's far from a voice of reason, but there are actual officials in the Israeli government that have talked about essentially nuking Gaza, destroying Gaza, killing all the Gazans, all that type of rhetoric. And he hasn't done I think there was one war cabinet member that he kind of demoted or said he'll stay in the war cabinet, but we won't meet with them anymore. He won't participate in cabinet meetings. But Hamas, is entrenched in Rafah, but so are a million Gazans that have nowhere to flee. And it'd be one thing if Israel was feeding humanitarian aid to the Gazans, if they had a refugee corridor to allow that nearly half of their population in Gaza to travel back to central or northern Gaza. But they're not doing anything like that. They're trying to starve the Gazans, eliminate 90% of the humanitarian aid that's attempting to arrive. And that's what's forcing Biden to try to airdrop aid packages, food to the starving Gazans, to have this humanitarian port, which I support in concept. I don't think it's really that feasible to accomplish, but really we need to do what Larry said, and that is to cut off military assistance altogether and say you're not getting another dime until you end the war. And that doesn't mean they have to end the war necessarily by immediately withdrawing all Israeli troops, but they have to stop the killing. There has to be an immediate ceasefire. There has to be an armistice that'd be followed by peace negotiations along, perhaps along the lines that I've proposed. But the Israeli endgame, they are of course trying to secure the last major stronghold of Hamas. I mean, I think there are some Hamas pockets in the north as well that they're beginning to move against at the same time. But this is a red line that Biden has set, and all indications are, as Larry said, that Netanyahu is going to cross it. And what's Biden going to do once he does?
Larry, do you want to add something?
Yeah, he's going to write a stern letter.
Yeah.
It is. I've been, by virtue of being old, so I've been watching the different iterations of U.S. madness on this going back, starting in 1985 with the CIA. And we don't ever seem to really learn anything. We get locked into these, I'll call them ideological constructs. And anybody that tries to stray from those constructs gets ostracized in Washington. I learned this sort of firsthand. I was friends with Jerry Bremer, L. Paul Bremer. Remember him? He was the hoobah put in charge of Iraq right after the invasion. And so, in fact, I had lunch with Jerry a week before he was named to become, the mullah of Baghdad.
Proconsul.
Yeah, the proconsul, exactly. And so when it was announced, I called him up. I said, "Hey, man, what?" I said, "Who did you piss off?" He goes, "Well, when the president calls, you got to say yes." So I said, "Well, hey, let me help you out. I want to introduce you to Pat Lang." Pat, at that time, had retired, but he had been the chief of the Middle East Division of Defense Intelligence Agency. He had set up the Arabic program at West Point and taught the Arabic program at West Point for 2 years. And he was defense attaché to Saudi Arabia and to Yemen. And most importantly of all, he was the one who hand carried U.S. intelligence to the Iraqi Defense Forces during the Iran-Iraq War. Nobody knew Iraq and that situation better than Pat. And Jerry's response, "No, I don't need to talk to him." And so I had gone to work at the Office of Counterterrorism just as Jerry left. So that's where I first knew him. Yeah, he brought with him all of these people that used to work in the counterterrorism shop at State. Jessica LaCroix, Clay McManaway, people who had zero experience in in Iraq. And they screwed it up. Are we surprised? But out of that is like my criticisms came. Jerry wrote me off, wouldn't talk to me. Relationship was broken. But it's a price you got to pay sometimes. That trying to tell the truth in Washington is not a very career enhancing move. Let's put it that way.
David, when it comes to how we can implement this peace proposal in the Middle East, it comes to a moment that you're talking about dividing Gaza in two parts, the East Gaza and West Gaza. Could you elaborate on that? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So what I mean is just like my peace proposal in the national interest that I published on October 1st of 2022. Essentially, what it would do is it'd be a Korean War style armistice. It would freeze the line of control. I mean, that's the easiest way to end any conflict, of course. And of course, there could be give and take, and the lines could be changed. But essentially, the only way to make it acceptable to both Israel and Hamas is essentially, leave Israel in control of a good part of Gaza and leave Hamas in control of their own enclave, and whether that's 30% or 50% or maybe even 15%. That's a question that can be decided. But Israel needs to immediately lift its air, land, and sea blockade of Gazans. It needs to show that it is it's not going to get any international respect back. I mean, there's been a tremendous international backlash against these Israeli war crimes against the Gazan civilians, and even President Trump, he's raised it repeatedly. He said Netanyahu's stupid. He hasn't called them war crimes, but he said it's been a PR disaster. So even from an Israeli diplomatic perspective, it should be in their Israeli leaders should realize that it's in their interest to at least feign some kind of humanitarian concern, which they haven't done to date. And one way to do that would be to grant them a lot of the same rights as in their own I forget what it's called, basic law or whatever, essentially. Not the rights of citizenship, of course, but even if it became an Israeli autonomous region where it's not annexed, but it's Israeli controlled for a period of a few years around that, then they need to have as many rights as possible. And maybe that's not the right of search and seizure, but it needs to be the rights of electing some kind of being able to elect representatives, and many other rights that are basic to our Constitution. So that they're not living in constant fear, as essentially, I mean, I don't know if I want to use this example because it's not really that relevant, but it's essentially the way Hitler treated the Jews before the war, before the Holocaust began, before the war actually began. The Jews were second-class citizens, and it's tragic to see that the Jews are, Israeli Jews, not all Jews, of course, but the Israeli government has decided to treat Palestinians in the same fashion, and just as a matter of being a Christian conservative, I'm not an evangelical, not someone who believes has this messianic belief. Of course, I believe that Israel's a chosen people, but that doesn't mean that the Israeli government does the right thing all the time. And as we see, sometimes they do the right thing in defense of Israel and in Israel's best interest, but oftentimes they take actions that are inimical to Israel's long-term interests, and diplomatically isolate them and actually create a much greater security threat than they otherwise would have had if they had responded in a more measured way to the atrocities committed by Hamas on October 7th. They would have had international support. If they hadn't invaded Gaza per se, perhaps they had border raids, special forces that kind of went in and tried to take back as many hostages as possible. They wouldn't have lost international support, and now they're becoming almost an international pariah. Even in the non-Western world. Essentially, I think as Larry pointed out, I mean, Erdogan views Netanyahu as a new Hitler. And I think that viewpoint is shared across the Muslim world. And Israel needs to change that, or it'll never achieve any measure of true security.
Larry, this
Yeah,
concept
well,
of dividing Gaza in two parts and how to manage that.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the intent there, and it'd be perhaps worth a try. But the reality is, the reason Hamas grabbed those hostages, and they were going to take more. I believe their goal was to grab at least 1,000 hostages, if possible, because there are 3,000 to 4,000 Palestinians being jailed by the Israelis illegally. I mean, they're picked up, arrested with no charges. They don't have any kind of due process. They're experienced torture. It's repeated evidence of that. So the Israeli jailers mistreat these Palestinians, and that's what Hamas wants. So let's get a release of those hostages. That's a difficult bargain to pull off now, because Hamas, they're probably down to 70, 80 of the original 250 hostages that they captured, if nothing else, ones that have died in captivity. But the goal is to work out that exchange. This is, what we're dealing with here is it's a generational change. So I'm of the generation, I was 6 years old when Paul Newman, Lauren Bacall, Exodus, the movie came out. And that movie it had a powerful cultural influence in the United States, written by Dalton Trumbo, who had just come out in having been blackballed in Hollywood as a communist. And that image of Israel as David fighting the Goliaths of the Arab world. And it's always the little guy fighting against the bigger guy, always the underdog. And we're Americans, man. We love underdog stories. Okay, we like the rags to riches and the guy that pulls them up by the bootstraps. And so Israel has dominated that conversation over the last 60 years, and that's now changing. And it's changing in a fundamental way, as we're seeing with these college campus protests. Israel has lost the generation that's under 30. And I don't think they're going to recover from that. And that's going to, it may not change the policy right now, but 5 years from now, 10 years from now, the United States is not going to be out there enabling Israel like we have been. And that's part of what Israel needs to come to grips with. Their sugar daddies drying up. That's the simplest way I could put it.
David, when it comes to this new protests in the United States, at the Columbia University, other universities, people are asking for a proper policy in Gaza. And how do you find these type of movements?
Well, I mean, first I want denounce the protests because they are, I think, too radical, too far in support of Hamas. I think Hamas is a terrorist organization. I believe Iran is really the greatest terrorist power in the world now. But I do agree at the same time with Larry and his assertions that the U.S. has also been a supporter of terrorism. We've supported. So it's kind of like the Soviets did the same thing. The Soviets supported terrorists that were pro-Soviet. We support terrorists that serve our perceived purposes, whether actually in the U.S. national security interest or not. But Iran, I think, has been the greatest terrorist power, and they supported both Shiites and Sunnis. But I think the protesters, obviously, what they want more than anything is fair treatment for the Gazan civilians. And so, just like the Israelis overreacted to the Hamas attacks by going too far and starving and bombing at least 22,000 mostly women, children, civilians. I think the protesters are kind of going too far. I mean, I think that the cause, if they define the cause as humanitarian, I think the cause is just. If they define the cause as pro Hamas and having Israel ethnically cleansed, I think, of the Jews, then that's something I would strongly oppose. Despite all our conversation here, I remain a supporter of the state of Israel, not the current government, not the policy, not the war, not the humanitarian violations, the war crimes. I want all that to end. I want Israel to return to being a member of the international community that's responsible, that's led by a rational leader, and that doesn't invade other countries and bomb other countries with impunity, much like the U.S. has done. Because Israel, I think, views itself as kind of a mini U.S. It's not really in some respects, it's an imperial power. It doesn't really control any other countries around it, but it, like the U.S. Empire, we bomb other countries with impunity, and there has to be more diplomacy. There has to be a negotiated solution. That's the only way to end the conflict. There's no way for the U.S. or Israel to achieve absolute security with purely military solutions. We have to work together with the powers that exist in the world today, whether it's Iran in the Middle East or Russia, China, even North Korea. We have to resolve these long-standing disputes if we were to ensure the survival of the United States and its allies.
Larry.
Oh, no, well, I was just commenting. I think I disagree with David on Iran's status as the #1 sponsor of terrorism in the world. It's the United States, hands down. Because I've made a sort of a hobby of going back and counting actual terrorist attacks and ones that are attributed to Iran. Iran was very active in terrorism in the 1980s. That's absolutely true. And a lot of, the bombings of the Marine barracks and in the U.S. Embassy in Beirut in 1983. But that was a direct response to U.S. shelling into the Hezbollah positions in the Bekaa Valley. So there's always a context. It's not that Iran is rising up and saying, I hate America and I hate American ways. Let's remember that part of the reason Iran's in the situation it is because of us. We're the ones who overthrew the democratically elected regime of Mossadegh in 1953. And what's really astonishing is from 1981 through 1988, the United States and Israel were supplying weapons to Iran. Now think about that. Iran's carrying out terrorist attacks against us, and we're sending weapons to Iran. Doesn't make sense to me, but that's how we're doing it. And I keep that in mind because put yourself in the Iranian shoes. You got to look at the United States and go, what the hell are they trying to do? Okay, so here's Iran. We know that America hates us. 2003, America invades Iraq. We get rid of Saddam Hussein, a Sunni Ba'athist who's been persecuting our Shia brethren, and we install Shia in power. And the Iranians go, Allah be praised. I mean, hey, those Americans are working for us. So as I say, this, I don't mean to try to do so much humor with this, but it's so absurd. that we box in Iran into a particular thing. And, okay, we got to make them the enemy. And part of the reason we make them the enemy is we got to have something to justify a $800-900 billion defense budget. I'm just saying that I think, you know what? If the Israelis could find a way to live with the Iranians for 8 years while Iran was in its Islamic glory, I mean, I would suggest they were far more extreme in the 1980s than they are now. I mean, they were stringing up homosexuals every other day with cranes out in the streets. If Israel could get along with Iran back then, I'm thinking they might be able to find a way to get along with them now. And the same for us. I'm not saying that everything Iran's doing is right, or, but, this road to war, it's one thing if, you're the one going out fighting it. If you're going to say, okay, yeah, I think we ought to do this, and I'm going to make sure I'm the one on the front lines. I'm on the pointy end of the spear. But that's not what happens. These politicians that sit on their ass in Washington and talk tough, they send some kid out on the front line. I have a nephew that got shot up in Iraq, in Baghdad, in one of the ambushes, and it caused him severe damage. The politicians that sent him, they didn't pay the price. He did. And then when it comes with the medical bills, he's like, "Hey, buddy, you're on your own." So I just, I'm not so much a peacenik, but I just think we've given the war thing a good shot. And I think, as David correctly noted, all these unnecessary wars of choice, the endless wars, maybe it's come time to put an end to them.
David, one of the problems that we are witnessing right now is this name calling people, especially governments. You just said that Iran terrorists, we did, Russia did, and you see these type of calling these people, say Putin, just calling Putin a new Hitler. Do you think how this policy is working for the United States? Because so far it didn't work at all. In Ukraine doesn't work. Right now in Taiwan, the same thing. Why they start pushing this type of policy of name calling leaders of these countries?
Well, I'm all for telling the truth about other countries. So when Blinken gets all shifty and concerned when Biden calls Xi a dictator, I mean, that's just ridiculous. I mean, Xi's a dictator. He's he's a mass murderer dictator. He's obviously not on par with Mao. Maybe he will be if he destroys the U.S. and kills a couple 100 million Americans, because we provoke him, or rather fight a war against China over Taiwan. But the idea that Putin is Hitler is ridiculous. Putin has no designs. He had no territorial designs whatsoever on Ukraine. Initially, he wanted, he wanted to guarantee that Ukraine would never join NATO. But as Larry stated, we have all these unnecessary wars we've been fighting. There's a myth that U.S. military presence and involvement in wars has made the world a safer and more secure place. It's done the exact opposite.
Yeah.
I mean, stemming from 1917, when we declared war on Germany, we transformed a war that would have ended in a compromised peace that would have potentially ended, prevented the Soviet Union from ever forming, or communist China or North Korea for that matter, or Vietnam, into the Treaty of Versailles, which gave birth to, communism in Russia and elsewhere throughout the world, and Nazism and Hitler and in World War II and the Holocaust. And we've been doing the same thing ever since on a lesser scale. U.S. involvement in World War II didn't, it liberated 7 Western European countries. The rest of Europe fell under brutal communist genocidal rule. It created the conditions for China to fall to communism. And we see the same thing repeating itself, just like Larry said, helping Iran. Reagan armed Iran under Iran-Contra. We sent them $2 billion worth of Hawk and TOW missiles which they used to get the upper hand over Iraq, which Reagan himself had stated by 1983 we wouldn't allow Iraq to lose the war. And Saddam Hussein was fighting a war against Iranian terror that was 100% of the U.S. national security interest, in my opinion. And he actually offered to do so again in the interwar period, and he was dumbfounded why we didn't accept it. There was no reason for us to attack and invade Iraq in 2003 because Saddam wanted to ally with us against Iranian terrorist factions and Al Qaeda itself. So yeah, the U.S. policy has been irrational, and it's an imperial policy. I've started calling it that because it is. The war in Ukraine is a war not of Russian imperialism but of U.S. imperialism, and Israel's kind of a different situation. The Gaza situation is different. It's not necessarily a creature of U.S. imperialism, but it's still a war that as Larry stated, we can end. We have, the U.S. is still one of the greatest superpowers in the world, and we have tremendous unused diplomatic influence and potential where we could, I'm skeptical. I have to be honest. I'm skeptical that we could get Israel to fully withdraw from Gaza, maybe over the medium term. But Israel is they're pretty self-sufficient. They're the fourth largest nuclear power. Speaking militarily, obviously not economically self-sufficient. But we need to move in that direction. And so I hope that your viewers will contact their representatives wherever they are in the world, whether they're in the U.S. or Brazil or elsewhere in the world, and urge them to support peace. A Reagan policy of peace through strength isn't what we're seeing today. It's Biden's policy, the neocon policy, is a policy of war through weakness. And it's the exact opposite, I would argue, of what Reagan would have done. And Reagan was a great president because he refused to go to war against the Soviets. And he managed an end to the Cold War. And I think we could do the same, certainly with Russia, perhaps even with China as well.
Larry.
And Iran.
Yeah, no, look, we've got to, when you keep doing the same thing over and over and getting the same result, that's the definition of insanity. And we've now got 60 years, 70 years of active regime change. Started really 1948 and continued. And it'd be one thing if we say, boy, that regime change, it's worked out so well. The world is so much better off. We're at peace. Bees are buzzing and birds are singing. That's not the case. And the real irony right now, and this is not so much related to Gaza, but Gaza is simply the U.S. response to Gaza is a symptom of a much deeper sickness that David's alluded to. That our response to Russia's military invasion of Ukraine in 2022 has set off a chain of events that is now completely destroying the international rules-based order that the United States set up. Financially, legally, it's coming apart. The United States is no longer in control of that process. And Russia and China now are poised to be the leaders of this in a way that we're not. We're struggling to stay relevant, but we're not able to. When you can't even stop the Houthis, you need to step back and go, okay, maybe we need to rethink what we're doing because we're embarrassing ourselves. Who's going to be afraid of you if the Houthis can stand off the U.S. Navy? Think about that. And for 6 months. So what? The U.S. sends its aircraft carrier. We'll just, we'll move around. We won't stay in the same place every night. And, the United States failure to come to grips because I disagree with Donald Trump. He says, boy, we got the best military, the strongest military in the world. And I said, nah, I think we got the most expensive military in the world. We got some of the most expensive weaponry that doesn't necessarily work well. That's the other thing that's been exposed, that was exposed with the Iranian missile attack. What you saw there is a preview of the war with China. And what I mean by that, if I'm the Chinese, I've got 100,000 drones right now, okay? And then I've got that backed up by 20,000 cruise missiles. And then I have that backed up by 1,000 hypersonic missiles, just locked and loaded, ready to go. A U.S. naval task force or multiple task force get near to my shore, launch the drones, and then launch the cruise missiles so they arrive about the same times as the drones, and then launch the hypersonic missiles, you'll destroy every ship. Because they don't have enough air defense on that system to shoot down 10,000 drones each. I mean, it's just, then you don't have to be a Hollywood movie producer to figure this one out. That's the future right there. So the conventional response with military, that's history. Russia is showing right now a modern battlefield, and Iran showed another dimension of it the other day. And we better damn well pay attention, because the conventional plans that exist, all these war games you've seen them run, not a single one of them have dealt with a drone cruise missile storm. Not one. They've all, we'll fire at them and they'll fire back at us, and we're going to play sort of by Hoyle's rules. God. People that write that crap have never been in a fight.
Just to wrap up this session, David, I want to talk about this Antony Blinken's recent visit to China. And
sorry, I'm not laughing at David. I'm laughing at Blinken.
David, why they have passed an aid for Taiwan, and right after that, they're trying to convince China to help them in Ukraine. And do you find any sort of logic behind this?
No, there's no logic at all. I mean, it was ridiculous. China and Russia have been staunch allies. I mean, I've been at the forefront of warning about the Sino-Russian alliance even before it was formalized. It was formalized in July 2001. I was a Georgetown master's degree student getting my second graduate degree, and I warned that the greatest existential threat the U.S. would ever face in the 21st century was from the Sino-Russian alliance. And certainly Russia and China's alliance has grown much closer and much more powerful since then. But yeah, it's ridiculous. I mean, we see the U.S. ask Russia to beg them not to to reestablish arms control treaties while we're helping Ukraine bomb the crap out of them, Russian targets. And then in China, we revealed some U.S. intelligence that Russia was going to invade Ukraine, and gave them all the top secret stuff and begged them to help. And well, they'd already greenlighted it, on February 4th, 2022 at the Beijing Olympics, so when they proclaimed their no limits partnership. And then, with Taiwan, I don't think the Biden administration is all that serious about defending Taiwan, but nevertheless, they've jettisoned 44 plus years of U.S. policy, which was strategic ambiguity that served the U.S. very well, and established strategic clarity that Biden has said every single time, and has never taken it back, that the U.S. will defend Taiwan militarily. So China is acting; they are preparing to fight a war against the U.S., mobilizing economically and militarily in the belief that Biden will make good on his threat. So the idea that China's going to help us at all while we're sending aid to Taiwan, even if it never gets there, which I really doubt that it ever will, or even that most of the $8 billion is for Taiwan at all. I think probably it's 2 billion max. It's a ridiculous idea. We need to negotiate every vital interest that Russia and China has. We need to negotiate with them, meet with them now, and resolve it in the best way we can. Maximizing whatever rights we can assure for Taiwan for a peaceful reunification. And that's hard for me to say as a longtime supporter of Taiwan, but as Trump has stated, there's no possible way for the U.S. to defend Taiwan against the Chinese invasion. If we do, the U.S. will lose, and it will lose catastrophically, not only conventionally, militarily in the Pacific region, but will likely provoke a massive attack on the U.S. as well. So I also believe that Iran has super EMP satellites, as North Korea. We know North Korea has. Russia, it's been recently revealed, either has those or has them ready to launch. China, we know, has hypersonic glide vehicles that they could use for the same purpose. We live in a very dangerous world, and the fate of the entire Western world, perhaps even the entire world, rests on what Biden does, if and when China invades Taiwan or blockades them. So, we're facing war on multiple fronts. This could be a 3-front war. It could be a 4-front war if North Korea invades South Korea. And there has to be sanity, as you and Larry have been championing. There has to be some sanity in U.S. Foreign policy that simply doesn't exist today.
Larry.
I was a Fox News talking head in November of 2002. And I was on the Hannity and Combs show. And the question arose, can the United States, should we be invading Iraq? And I said, no, we're not in a position to fight a 2-front war. We need to finish what we're doing in Afghanistan before we go into Iraq. That led to a phone call from Roger Ailes to the producer subsequently, even though I was under contract. They said, I don't want that guy on air anymore. So, but I was right. Fox, to its credit, did pay out the contract. So, I have no complaints on that. But nobody wanted to hear the message. We can't fight a 2-front war. Hell, we can't even fight a 1-front war right now. And I agree with everything David said about the situation we're in. I don't know where this change took place, but in 52 years ago, when Nixon went to China, and they agreed upon they agreed with the one China policy. That means Taiwan is part of China. Americans sort of went along. And the reason we did that was we wanted to use China, pit China against Russia, keep those two apart. It's like that scene in Ghostbusters where you got Rick Moranis and Sigourney Weaver. Got to keep them apart. You don't want them to get together or be the end of the world. Well, we've managed to bring Russia and China together like nobody's business, and we got a new world. So we better come to grips with it, because it's not one that we can defeat and change militarily. Or if we try to address it militarily, we will destroy ourselves. And, I'd prefer to at least be a cranky 90-year-old at least, so I'm pushing 70, so at least give me another 20 years. So I think, we're in the most dangerous time in my life, I believe. The opportunity for wrong decisions that can really escalate into something terrible are plentiful. And I just pray to God that we find somebody with some wisdom to say, hey, everyone, put your guns down, step back, take a deep breath.
I want to wrap up this session, David, if you want to add something.
No, I just echo what Larry said. It used to be during the Cold War, we were led by clear-eyed realist presidents, stretching from Truman to Reagan and arguably Bush Sr. And then, with Clinton, we just started pursuing this strategy of liberal hegemony, and it's been disastrous for America. And we've lost every war but one. I mean, I would say we lost Iraq as well. Iraq War I, Desert Storm, because look at Iraq is now under Iranian control, essentially. It's an Iranian satellite state.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have to elect new leaders. I mean, it was really heart-rending to see Johnson switch sides, the deep state, and the globalists, and support Ukrainian aid. Because that just, unless Trump can become president and not be influenced by his advisors to go the neocon route again, then I just don't have a lot of hope for U.S. foreign policy changing.
Thank you so much. Larry, do you want to add something?
What he said.
Thank you so much for being with us today. It was great. It was better than what I imagined. But
Thank you very much.
It was very constructive.
You're a ringleader or ringmaster.